Welcome all. This is the Garbage and Recycling Advisory Committee meeting. And we'll start with having everybody identify themselves. And let's start with Sandra.
Sandra Smith, unincorporated Washington County public member.
Vinod.
Vinod Singh, industry member living in unincorporated Washington County.
Beth.
Beth Vargas Duncan, industry member.
And come on, screen, do what I want. It's just not behaving.
Let me stop sharing this intro slide and maybe you can see everybody then.
Tom.
Good evening, Tom Eggleston, HHS non-voting member.
Sue.
Sue Shade, public member, unincorporated Washington County.
And Aaron.
Aaron Stein, staff member with Washington County Solid Waste and Recycling.
And Kathy.
Kathy Folsom, staff member, unincorporated. I live in unincorporated Washington for Washington County staff.
Okay. And in the magic of modern computing, I lost the agenda. So what's next, Tom?
Rosalind's in the room.
Okay, perfect. I'll go ahead and promote her to panelist and then I'll go through the screen, just introducing the kind of the outline of this evening, and then you can go for the agenda. Ken, does that work?
That works.
Okay. Let me promote Rosalind really quickly, and then I'll share my screen again. All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the September 9th Garbage and Recycling Advisory Committee meeting. Oops, I have subcommittee. It's the committee meeting. Everyone should be connected via audio. The presentation is recorded. It's going to be posted to the Solid Waste and Recycling webpage within 1 week. If you have any questions this evening for GRAC committee members, we ask that you submit those through the Q&A, and the agenda does allow time for comments. Only the committee chair may recognize a public attendee. You can use the Q&A to submit that to the panelist or raise your hand. We do have 2 designated times on the agenda for comment. And when it's time, if anybody's called in versus joining us via Zoom, I will unmute them and just make sure they don't have any questions or comments for the group. And with that, I will stop sharing and you can take it away.
Okay, Tom, you want to do the updates?
Sure, just a couple really quick updates. This week, actually, on the 7th, so on Tuesday, the Board of Commissioners approved the renewal of the franchise agreement for Recology Organics North Plains. Your committee had recommended that approval back in May, and we took a little bit of time to put the brakes on the process after that to engage the city of North Plains a little further as they expressed some interest in further engagement. So we just brought it back to the board this last week and the board approved it. So that agreement is in place through 2026. And if you may recall, the agreement is substantially similar to the previous agreement. The tonnage cap for the facility remains 80,000 tons per year. However, they did receive an investment and innovation grant from Metro to invest in a mass bed composting process, which we anticipate will allow them to compost more material on the same footprint with less odor, presumably, and as what we've seen in other facilities. So might be some good opportunities for some more communities like unincorporated Washington County to start thinking about residential food scraps and those kinds of opportunities as we go down that road. So that might be an item coming before the committee in the next 12 months or so, as we can kind of explore that further. There's also some new opportunities. South County with Pride Disposal now having the ability to transfer type 3 residential feedstock at their facility. So it kind of frees up some of the concerns about the single point of failure essentially in the system if we relied completely on that one facility. So we're going to start exploring those opportunities as we go forward, and we'll see where that goes. Couple other quick updates. We have the new administrative rules that the board adopted in June and the committee reviewed, I think at the end of May, beginning of June, are now in effect. We've been working with the Washington County Haulers Association to kind of offer any support and that they may need from the county in terms of providing some assistance on identifying trainers for implicit bias training, and also working to identify safe harbor languages that the county has identified through its limited English assistance plan. So we're happy to hear from several haulers that they're have some systems in place and they're working towards getting things set up. So that's good to hear. We're also preparing, our staff will be preparing to work with the Hauler Association on the multifamily service standards. As you recall, one of the sections of the rules was related to minimum service levels per unit at apartment complexes and multifamily units. And so kind of working to offer as much assistance as the county can to help the service providers notify property managers that might not be meeting that threshold, and trying to help facilitate the compliance into that new service level. We also recently became aware of a new bill pay assistance opportunity. It's connected to, it's very similar to the bill pay assistance program the county was operating through the CARES Act fund at the end of 2020. However, it is through the emergency rent assistance program from the state of Oregon. So this emergency rent assistance funding that's coming through the community action organizations includes utilities. And for the first time ever, I saw utilities also includes garbage service. So it's like we've come across over a hill. And since I think, I don't know, I won't take credit for it, but I think the region pushed to really get some CARES Act funds and get our community service organizations to include garbage in those kinds of emergency relief funds. And so now we're seeing it show up in state emergency rent assistance programs, which is really great to see that starting to show up and not necessarily even be a program of the county. So we're going to try to work with community action to make sure that customers are aware of it. The Haulers Association understands what the program is and what kind of customer might be eligible for it, and what type of resources are available. So it is still a segment of the population. It's, now we're looking at folks seeking rental assistance. And then if they're individually responsible for the garbage service, it'd be rental assistance in a single family unit likely, but there still is some folks that might be able to get some assistance. So we're looking forward to that. And I guess that's about it. My next update would be about the Ridwell exemption process, but the subcommittee has met 3 times since our last meeting. And Rosalind joined us to give us a presentation from Metro about the regional waste plan. So we have invited her back to talk to us a little bit further. And then we'll have an opportunity for the 3 subcommittee members this evening to share their perspectives and what they've learned and what they think about the process going forward. And we'll try to map out some next steps. So I'll hand it back to you, Ken.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Rosalind. I think it's your turn. Do I need to go get my copy of the plan, or it's not here? It's over by my recliner where I was reading it.
Well, I'm glad you have it right next to you at all times.
Do we want,
Well, it's a really daunting document.
Yeah.
It's online.
do we
Yeah,
want to
no.
check, Ken, real quick, if there's anybody in the queue that wants to provide comment to the committee for the first comment period?
Oh.
So if you are in the attendee pool and you would like to speak to the committee for 2 minutes on any topic, please raise your hand. All right, I don't see anything. Go ahead. Sorry, Rosalind.
Oh, no worries. Let me just change my view. Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here today and see everyone. My name is Rosalind Green. I'm the Policy Program Development Manager at Metro in what we call Waste Prevention and Environmental Services. It's the department at Metro that oversees and manages the regional solid waste system. And we also call it WPES or WPES. I've also heard it called. I tend to call it WPES, but you may hear it called something WPES. So I'm gonna just pause and share my screen and get my presentation up. Can you see the first slide?
Now we can, yes.
Great, okay. And so I really enjoy coming to groups like this to talk about the plan because I was there developing the plan and help assisting with the plan from start to finish. And so I'm really proud of this plan. It was a huge group involvement, as I'll tell you and elaborate in this presentation. It wasn't just Metro, it was local governments, it was community organizations, it was haulers, it was MRFs. We all came to, and DEQ, we all came around this plan and participated in some way. So I really think it's the region's plan. And I'm just really passionate about it because I spent a lot of time on it. At the time of this plan, I was actually in a different role on the analytics team. So I was one of the primary authors of the indicators, which I'll explain in a minute. So so I just really enjoy talking about it. And really the purpose of me being here today is not to give you a recommendation on how the committee should vote on the issue at hand. Rather, my goal is just to provide you with the information and context about the 2030 Regional Waste Plan because it's our region's guide to addressing and improving the garbage and recycling system. So my hope is the information I share with you will be useful and help you make an informed decision. So these are the questions I'm hoping to answer for you today. What is the history of the Regional Waste Plan? How was the 2030 Regional Waste Plan created? And what does the plan direct local governments and Metro to do? For this last question, I'm going to highlight actions and goals that I think are relevant to your discussion based on my knowledge and understanding of the issue. So the Regional Waste Plan is the guiding document for the work that local governments and Metros does collectively in the solid waste system. It's both a strategic document and also a blueprint for this work. So while this plan has a lot of unique elements, the planning approach is not new. Metro updates the Regional Waste Plan about every decade, and the 2030 Regional Waste Plan is the fourth plan of its kind. So yeah, and each one looks a lot different, and I'll just describe how this one is similar and unique. So the Regional Waste Plan, let's see. So this is our region's plan to meet our regional needs and aspiration, but it also fulfills Oregon statutory requirements for a reduction plan for the Tri-County area. And Metro is what is known as the waste shed rep. And is accountable to DEQ and the state for implementing and meeting the requirements of the state. And there's two pillars of the plan. It's really environment and equity. So environmental and the environment includes impact reduction and mitigation, including climate change. The 2030 Regional Waste Plan addresses the full life cycle of products, not just disposal, and calls for intervening early in the cycle to reduce the impacts of making and producing materials. So it's really intended to design to address the full life cycle of products, not just end of life. And traditionally, the plan has really focused on environment. A difference with the 2030 Regional Waste Plan is compared to previous plans is the focus on equity, which is is the second pillar. So the 2030 Regional Waste Plan is designed to address the historical inequities of the solid waste system related to environmental justice, worker pay, demographics of the workforce, company ownership, and access to services. And the 2030 Regional Waste Plan identifies 40 actions focused directly on advancing equity and reducing disparities in the system. So along the theme of equity, what makes the 2030 Regional Waste Plan also unique is the extensive stakeholder engagement that was used to build the plan, as I alluded to in the beginning of my presentation. And in this fourth plan, we also included community, which hadn't been an emphasis in previous plans. So this slide summarizes all of the input that was collected and used to inform the plan. First, we had the equity work group, and the equity work group was an advisory committee that helped guide the plan from beginning to end. There were representatives from different community groups, and the picture on top is a picture of the equity work group, and they really helped inform the plan. And I'll give you a specific example in a minute of how the equity work group informed the plan. We also had community forums where we pulled together community groups and their members and helped educate them on the solid waste system. So then they could have informed conversations about the plan and provide input in community forums. We had a community forum at the zoo and all throughout the region, bringing together elected officials and community members to talk about and discuss elements of the plan and what should be included. We also did general public surveys and had a lot of engagement just through general surveys. We also had technical work groups, and these technical work groups included folks from all across the industry and local governments and community, and they really helped inform the actions. So they had a few what we call technical work group meetings over the course of 6 months or so, and really dug into the actions and helped develop the actions, because it was really important that we had all perspectives included in the planning to really make it a regional plan. So I want to provide an example of how we use that feedback and how it impacted the plan. So this slide outlines the elements of each section of the plan. We have the values, which serve as the basis for the plan's goals and actions, and they help guide implementation. We also had the vision, which identifies the desired future of what we want the garbage and recycling system to look like. And then we had the goals, and the goals and actions are designed to close the gap between today and the desired future. And then we had the indicators, which I'm particularly passionate about, and these help demonstrate the impacts the plan activities are having on the region, highlight opportunities for improvement, and evaluate which programs and projects are helping us achieve the desired outcomes. The principles on this slide I'm circling and highlighting in particular because these principles were not suggested by Metro staff. They were suggested by our equity work group. So going back to the equity work group, the equity work group really appreciated our values and vision, but they felt like something was missing. And so we took what they gave us word for word and incorporated it in the plan. And these are the equity principles that are in the plan. And I'll just pause here for a minute so you can read them. So now going back to the goal areas, these are intended to advance Metro's values, principles, and policy vision. And the goal areas were incorporated into the plan and really serve as its chapters. There are 19 specific goals, 100 or more actions. As I mentioned, 40 of the actions are designed to advance equity. And for each action identified, there's a lead agency and an implementation approach listed. And the plan identifies the lead agency responsible for carrying out actions and the implementation approach. Some actions are local government led, some are co-led, and some are Metro specifically led. So Metro, as I mentioned, is responsible for coordinating the implementation of the plan and assessing the plan's performance. And the plan calls for the development of a 3-year work plan, or our blueprint, to support the transparency and accountability around implementation of the waste plan. So we just went through an extensive planning effort to develop the 3-year work plans. I'm happy to send the 3-year work plan after this this meeting, but the development of the shared work plan is identified as a key component of how we implement the plan, and the priorities that guide this, guided the selection of the actions by both Metro and local governments included a few categories that I just want to go over. Again, the required responsibilities. There's a group of actions that are required by state law, Metro code, Metro administrative rule, and these actions are primarily directed at ensuring that comprehensive and consistent recycling and garbage services are provided across the region. Some of the prioritized actions of the regional waste plan implementation strategy also represent guidance rather than requirements. And then some actions were also selected based on agency priorities, which in large part can be linked back to Metro Council or elected officials at the city and county level. And there are also priorities identified by community members. Again, for example, the 3-year work plan went to our Regional Waste Advisory Committee. It also went to County Council. And so every time we took it to these bodies, they provided input on what should be included in the 3-year work plan. So here's just an example of what the 3-year work plan looks like for one of the prioritized actions. This example is a co-led action. Both Metro and cities and counties are listed in the column titled Lead Agency. Metro's planned activities are listed in one column, local government activities in the other. And there's 3 categories of activities for local governments. There's co-led, and these are activities that are co-led with Metro and local governments. There's local government-led activities, which are just for local governments. And then there's individual activities, which is, I know, nuanced, but there are some local governments that chose to do actions that not all other cities or counties chose to do. So this one provides an example of Clackamas County. And I think I just wanted to show this to you, this level of detail. So when I send out the work plan, that it makes sense to you and you can kind of understand it, because there is a lot of information in it. So as I said earlier, implementation is shared by Metro and local governments, and to support local government-led and co-led actions, Metro distributes funding to cities and counties to satisfy state law. So in 2020 and 21, Metro distributed $2.3 million to cities and counties using a funding distribution method, and we're actually in the process of evaluating this distribution method because we've been doing the same way for a long time. And the 3-year work plan brought up kind of the need to do that. So we're in an assessment phase for this right now, which local governments are definitely involved in. And I just wanted to mention that is one of our current projects. So I'm just going to stop here and see if you have questions, because from here on, I will be going into, again, the various actions and goals that I think are relevant to this conversation. But before I do that, I just want to pause and see if you have any questions about how the regional waste plan was created, or what's in it, or the work plan, anything that may be confusing and you need clarification on.
I don't see any hands raised or anything.
Okay, great. So I think next I'm going to go through all the slides, and then we will go, and I'm not going to pause for questions. I think I want to go through all the slides, and then we can come back to the ones that you want to talk about, and I'm happy to show the slides after I go through them. And again, I just want to clarify that I was again invited here today to provide an overview of the regional waste plan. And I am not going to be, giving you a recommendation for the decision you're trying to make. I just want to say that one more time, because after somebody watched my last presentation, they took the presentation to mean that I was taking, or Metro was taking a stance on a particular stance on this issue. So I'm just saying it again for the record. Because I want to be clear that for I've included who's the, we've talked about, or I've mentioned who's the lead agency when it comes to some of these things. And it's the regional waste plan is clear that it's up to cities and counties to determine who can serve their customers and collect material. And within the context of this topic, Metro's role is really the regulation of facilities that accept, transfer, and process material. So that's why I'm just kind of giving you the information about the actions that I think are most relevant, and not giving you a recommendation regarding the decision that you're making. So I'll just go through these. I'll kind of talk a little bit about them. I won't read them word for word, but I just want to highlight again that this goes back to what I said about the regional waste plan being focused on the environment and the life cycle of products and reducing the environmental and human health impacts of products and packaging that are made, sold, used, or disposed in Oregon. So the actions around this really highlight kind of our work around product stewardship and the recent work on 582, the Recycling Modernization Act, because there are elements of that that address packaging and how packaging is manufactured. And the hope is to create a closed loop system with that bill. So, you know, we advocate for product stewardship on a number of different levels for that reason, including mattresses or other types of materials, not just what we put in our blue bin. And so, and in some cases, waste reduction just makes more sense instead of recycling things. So that's what this is also pointing to. The second slide also is along the same vein. Goal 6 is to reduce product environmental impacts and waste through education and behavioral practices related to prevention and better purchasing choices. I think for some materials, it just makes sense to have policies related to them and to reduce our use of them rather than recycling them. A couple of examples I could give are in terms of questions that I've heard related to whether it makes sense to recycle them are styrofoam and alkaline batteries are examples of where I've heard questions around the environmental benefits of recycling them. Because there are also, when we recycle things, there are environmental impacts of recycling them. And so we want to make sure that the environmental impacts, such as that there aren't negative impacts like human health or air quality in the process of recycling a material. Along these same lines, we want to provide cultural responsive community education, provide an increased accessibility to education and tools, and assist households and businesses in the adoption of practices that prevent the wasting of food. Because food is a high impact material when we send it to the landfill because it creates cheese in the land from the landfill. And it's also a high impact material in terms of the materials it takes to make food. So that's another environmental example of how waste prevention is actually more beneficial than recycling, but we still want to recycle that material because of the potential climate impacts. Goal 7, reduce product environmental impacts and waste through policies that support prevention practices. This is kind of along the same lines of what I'm talking, so I won't get into this one. In terms of regional collection and education services, goal 9 is increased knowledge among community members about garbage, recycling, and reuse services, provide culturally responsive education, and assist for garbage, recycling, and reuse services to residents and businesses. And we really have a focus through the plan on folks living in multifamily communities who don't have as much access to recycling service as people living in single family homes. Goal 10 is really, this is a big substantial goal area because it contains a lot of our statutory requirements. And it includes a bulk of the work that we do with local governments. So provide regionally consistent services for garbage, recyclables, and other priority materials. This includes providing comprehensive collection services and implementing standards for collection container color, signage. And this is where we're really focused on multifamily communities and making sure that recycling looks similar wherever you are, because we know that folks living in multifamily communities tend to move more often than people living in single family homes. We also have goal 9, which is increased knowledge among community members about garbage, recycling, and reuse services. And we really use Metro's Recycling Information Center as a hub for serving all residents and businesses in the region for opportunities to reduce, reuse, and dispose properly. Along the same lines of expanded recycling opportunities, we want to increase knowledge among community members about garbage, recycling, and reuse services. This includes one of our priorities, which is strategies around bulky waste collection services. This is an area that is very inconsistent across the region, and it also touches lots of different areas of our work, including RID, because mattresses are illegally dumped quite often, and other materials. So we're really looking at strategies for how we can collect more bulky waste in a responsible manner. We also, 10.7, partner with community health organizations to expand options for collection of needles. We all know needles are a challenging issue at so many levels, and advocate for statewide legislation or implement regional policies to increase the types of products and packaging for which manufacturer. So this is kind of going back to what I've already highlighted around product stewardship. Regulation, goal 12, manage all garbage and recycling operations to reduce their the nuisance, safety, and environmental impacts on workers and the public. So action 12.12, implement consistent and enforceable safety standards for facilities. I mentioned Metro is the lead agency on that. And then we talked at the GRAC committee about 12.5, which is the regulate collection of solid waste materials by collectors not otherwise regulated by local governments. So this one is particularly relevant to what you're talking about today. And as I noted, the lead agencies are really cities and counties on that action. And then 12.6, regulate facilities accepting garbage, recycling, food scraps, yard debris, and other solid waste generated from the region. We have some projects around this right now around food waste that I won't get into in detail, but this is again a role that Metro plays in the system. Emerging businesses. This is in our kind of shared prosperity section of the plan, really focused on equity, and it's the goal is increase the percentage of garbage and recycling system revenue that benefits local communities and companies owned by people of color and other underrepresented groups. So implement strategies in consultation with the community organizations that can be adopted by local governments to ensure greater racial equity and ownership and management of collection service providers. And this is really getting to company ownership, because we want not just a diverse workforce, but also opportunities for new emerging businesses to be able to have opportunities within the system. Also along the lines of workforce equity, we want to ensure that all jobs in the garbage and recycling industry pay living wages and include benefits. There's actions in this goal around establishing a living wage, incorporating good job provisions, and also reducing the use of temporary and contracted workers in the region's solid waste industry. Yeah, so that speaks for itself. And that is all the actions I have to highlight. Thomas, I think I'll turn it over, or Ken, should I turn it over to you? Do you have any other things to add to the presentation, or should we just open it up for questions?
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add, Rosalind. Thank you very much again. And I think turning it over to any questions would be a good opportunity or time to ask questions or seek further clarification if anyone has any more questions for Rosalind.
I do. Let's go back to slide, let's see, 19, goal 10.
Yeah.
Nowhere in this slide or anywhere else that I've seen has anybody sat down and done a definitive, this is an essential service, this is not an essential service, spreadsheet or something. Or this is something that is currently not an essential service, but we see it becoming an essential service in the foreseeable future, like food collection or food waste collection. And I know that the committees are doing a job trying to get people to stop wasting food, since we already know that half the food that we goes through our system gets wasted. So is there a reason that Metro chose not to delineate what is currently essential and what is future essential as it's brought into the mix, and things that will never be essential?
And Ken, are you talking from kind of a material, like a hierarchy of materials, kind of what we collect and don't collect? Or are you talking about, like when you say service, what's an example?
Collecting garbage,
Yeah,
which is clearly an essential service. Sewage is clearly an essential service.
yeah. So we have what,
We tried for years to get schools put on the state law as an essential service. Ironically, schools are not an essential service in the state of Oregon. It's just politics. But
great.
if
Thank you
something for the purposes of our discussion, if something is currently or is anticipated to become in the foreseeable future an essential service, then we would it would be incumbent on us to regulate it, authorize it, and manage it. If it's something that will never be regulated, like departure times at Hillsborough Airport, which in this jurisdiction are not regulated, but in some parts of the country are regulated. Nobody may take off in their jet before 6 in the morning or after 11 o'clock at night. Those kinds of things. So
Yeah,
what can be or not can be regulated, but in our world is, because we're asked specifically, this was all driven by Ridwell. And from my perspective, the question of whether or not it's an essential service now or will become an essential service shortly or longly, but mostly shortly, has a huge bearing on how we propose to deal with them.
right. So thank you for elaborating on that. Metro has a regional service standard that addresses requirements that speak to 10.1. So an example for the regional service standard, it had standards related to the frequency of collection and what gets collected. And so recently we upgraded that regional service standard to include standards for multifamily communities, because it previously was only for single family communities. And so what I mentioned, color coding, the amount of capacity or the cubic yards per unit for garbage and recycling, those are the types of things that we'll be implementing for multifamily that weren't previously a requirement. But these are really focused on recyclables and do not include organics. And so that's just an example of how far or not it goes right now. I think what you're also speaking to is what's on the acceptable list in terms of materials. And so 582, and that is largely, so 582, the Recycling Modernization Act is going to create a standard list of recyclables that is collected throughout the state. So what you can recycle in the metro region will be recyclable at the coast and in Southern Oregon. And through that process, we're going to have criteria for how we pick those materials. And so that will create a framework for deciding what should be recycled at the curb, so we'll be revisiting some of the materials probably that we're putting in our curbside bin, as well as materials that we're not putting in our curbside bin. So that's going to be a comprehensive process led by DEQ, because it's important on a statewide level to have this conversation and to address it at a state level. So I hope that answers your question. It's kind of speaking to what kind of Metro's role is versus DEQ and some of the work on the horizon.
As we get into food processing, I think the political force, in addition to collecting food scraps, will be to ensure that hazmats of any kind do not go into landfills. And I would anticipate that the things you mentioned, styrofoam and alkaline batteries will be supplemented by things like car batteries, leftover insecticides, and those things. The things that you currently pick up at your voluntary pickup sites 2 or 3 times a year that we can take all our leftover hazmats to. We would prefer that they get dealt with responsibly rather than going into a landfill. Do you anticipate a point at which we essentially mandate that people put their unused hazmat leftover, paints and insecticides, herbicides, and other kinds of things, and batteries? There is no category of battery that is not a hazmat. So I would like to see a time when those were brought in under the umbrella of, if you're a hauler, you will collect this kind of thing, like we do for the other kinds of waste. And that's what I anticipate. That's what I'm trying to look forward to as we try to negotiate our way through, whether do we grant a waiver or do we insist that they go get some kind of authorization or whatever.
I think, Ken, I can try to talk about this a little bit. I would say it's a really difficult question to answer because it's a moving target a little bit.
Well, you bet.
With the business recycling requirement as an example, that was put in place in 2009. So you could argue that prior to 2009, recycling at a business was not considered an essential service. So after the business recycling requirement was put in place, we signaled that becomes an essential service now. But at the same time, garbage service is not even a requirement of a resident or a business in Washington County. Not creating a nuisance is a requirement. So that makes it maybe less of an essential service. I would argue that garbage certainly is an essential service. That's the core function that our division operates, is to prevent health and human hazard associated with garbage accumulating and not being collected. So what add-on becomes an essential service is a really good question. And I think it's part of this conversation, but it's also not necessarily, I think, the Action 10 doesn't necessarily drive into that too far. It kind of highlights the core services provided by the system, and then and what those requirements are and what those really core base level services are. What goes on beyond that is the question, I guess, that we're grappling with, right?
Well, I think it's incumbent on us at some point, maybe not immediately, and it's certainly not the case now, but things we want to be handled responsibly, it needs to be made as easy as falling off a rock to accomplish. So when I had an old couch that had been severely scratched by a cat, I found out that nobody would take it. It just was not available to dispose of, period. And so, it ended up essentially going in a landfill. But that was not what I would have liked. And I would like to see a situation where we move forward enough that we inflict on somebody the responsibility for taking it. And I know the Europeans have been much more active in, if you make it, you take it back, or you figure out what to do with it kinds of approaches than we have so far. And so far you can put stuff into the stream and you don't have to worry about getting it back out of the stream. But I would like to see us moving, and I think we are moving in that direction. So, and what I don't want to create is a monster where we have made a decision that blocked our being able to do that in the future.
So Beth and Venate both, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I'll jump in first. I know
Thank you,
Ken
Beth.
probably can't see hands very well. So I just wanted to.
Should I stop sharing? Would that be easier?
Yeah, why don't you, and we can go back to something if someone asks.
Okay.
Or wants to.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. So I just wanted to say that you mentioned batteries, Ken, as whether or not those should be, I don't remember exactly, but when you were talking about, essential items or items that would be regularly collected, I think we might have brought this up in the past, but it's good to note that at least in the Salem metro area, Marion County, they do collect batteries as a part of the curbside program, for example. So there is some variation across the state as to what is collected curbside right now. So, and that could very well expand as local governments so choose until there is a statewide list.
And Beth, are the batteries collected similar to like motor oil would be here? It's separate on the side?
Yeah.
thing?
Right, it's in your quote glass bin, the little side bin, and you can just put it out as you would the other items that would go in that bin in a little baggie. It's part of your regular collection and rate.
So if you, I agree with you, Beth, and I think there will be a point where enough momentum has occurred, enough municipalities or what have you have made it a local requirement that it becomes a statewide requirement or equivalent. Because you start with people voluntarily, people wanting to get rid of something in a responsible way, and then you get people like Batteries Plus and others taking batteries voluntarily. Just bring it to us and we'll take it. And then subsequently, I would expect it to become something that the haulers are then required. And I believe, are our haulers required to pick up batteries? No. Okay.
Well, it depends on where you are, because in Marion County, yes.
Right. I was just thinking Washington County, unincorporated Washington County. Do we require that?
We should.
Nobody's appointed me king yet. I don't get to do really broad things.
So I was actually going to bring up the Marion County example also, because I was talking to somebody down there about how they collect it, and I was curious. What I was trying to get at was, do they find them less in the curbside mix because they offer that collection? Because they start fires, and I've talked to glass people. We're getting off topic here, but glass people, they have problems with the batteries going through the system, and they actually end up leading the glass for the bottle. So there's other issues that batteries do. And I don't know if this lends to where you were going, Ken, but I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, the recycling and refuse was considered essential services. So we had to get little written letters to carry around with us when we were driving around that said we were allowed to be on the road. So
Good. The next question.
I would, real quick, Ken, I would say, just in response to that, but not absolutely 100%. And then the county, we took a hard, firm stance that it was an essential service, and we wanted to make sure we could do everything we could to not have that service interrupted. And that included not just garbage, but recycling, yard debris, garbage collection, the whole suite of services.
I just remember being happy I had my little letter that I could carry.
Yeah. Luckily, there was no roadblocks and people with scary weapons that told you couldn't go anywhere. So
The next question I have was, you mentioned in 12.5, and it may be because I missed your presentation irresponsibly on my part last time. 12.5 says regulate other currently not regulated services. Do you have this is for Rosalind, do you have a list of things that sort of a pecking order of when you think that things that are currently not regulated will become regulated, or how you anticipate bringing them into the mix, kinds of things?
Yeah, no, I do not. I don't have, no, because again, this is the role of local governments, and both counties and cities are highlighted on that action. And Metro's role is really the regulation of the facilities that accept and process those materials. And so, you know, I will say that there's a lot of unregulated areas of solid waste, depending on how you define solid waste. You could, you know, there's the companies that collect bulky waste services. I don't want to name it's easier for me to say a company name, but I know I don't want to say a company name on a public meeting. So they pick junk up and take it away. So, and there's also other types. I don't know, Tom, if you have any other examples that you want to add.
yeah, so this is a really good question, Ken, and we dug into it a little further with the staff that were participating on one of the technical work groups. And we shared this with the subcommittee, but we could talk about it a little bit more now. Really, the Action 12.5 was proposed specifically, actually, in the beginning to identify the junk hauling fleet. I guess that's a good non-describing term, to bring those services into the fold. And those services currently under our regulatory scheme are not considered a solid waste collection company because the service of collecting solid waste is considered ancillary to the service they provide, which is junk removal. So this is kind of a nuance, but for example, if you're apartment complex manager and you hire a junk hauling company to come in and just collect a couch and an old dumped bed at the garbage enclosure, that's technically a violation of our franchise because that is a service that the solid waste collection system provides, and all that is happening is hauling of that material. Now, if there's an apartment that has material inside of it, like a big screen TV, and there's a couch left in the apartment, and the junk hauling company comes in and does a cleanup and takes the material out of the apartment unit and brings it down and then hauls it away, the hauling is then considered ancillary to that service. So that's a gray area, and that's how the current system is interpreted. And I think there is a lot of concern about those services, who's providing them, how is it ensured that that the service provision is happening in accordance with environmental rules and regulations, and we know the materials are going to a responsible place. Other examples, grease and fog hauling. So fats, oils, and grease is fog. So if a restaurant has a grease trap and they put out their grease out behind their business, then a company comes and takes it away. And that is a material that's in another gray area. It's currently not necessarily regulated, but there is a potential that it could be a material that may be brought into the system at some point in time. I'm trying to think of other similar service providers.
Well, there's
But
the gentleman down in Washington County who hauls away pruning stuff, but his service is getting rid of the pruning, not hauling. And so,
are you talking about like the composting process?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so businesses that haul, essentially, there's some businesses that haul for free material to a facility to compost it, and they're not hauling for compensation, so they're hauling for the material value or the material disposal in a sense. So there's some nuances involved in that.
And you're back to your cooking oil and leftover crankcase oil. There's a market value for that, and so the people who are taking it are using it and reformulating it into something else.
So that's a presumption, yeah. Is it being hauled for compensation or not? I don't know if that's very clear. I think there is some evidence to suggest that the value of much of that, especially the dirty grease, so the grease trap cleanings, is not a commodity that is easily salvaged for fuels or other things. So there might be a cost to the business to have it hauled. So that's a questionable area as well. And so I think I think listening to the folks that were on the technical work committee working on this, the initial proposed action was convene local governments to regulate non-franchise junk hauling fleet. So it was very specifically targeted at those junk hauling fleets that we were just talking about. And I do understand that through the process, going through the equity work group that Rosalind mentioned and some other stakeholder groups, it was broadened into what it is now, which is essentially regulating collection services that are otherwise unregulated, which is a big kind of open question.
Yeah, and my concern that from the wording of the actual goal was that our crystal ball doesn't give us a good picture of what is, when we know what's not, we know what is regulated. The whole universe out there is not regulated, as I understand it, and we are being asked in many ways to sort of pick and choose through the elements that are out there. What is likely to become, what is legitimately something that would be currently considered non-regulated that we should be regulating and looking into, and those kinds of things. Again, you get back to some really nuanced questions, and it's impossible to really anticipate and cover all the nuances with a verbal rule. So I don't want to beat it to death. So why don't we? Beth has had her hand up for a long time, and then Sandra has had her hand up. So Beth.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify, and I think Tom did get around to it, that we did have members of our industry that served on that committee that looked at 12.5 and have explained to us that they could not delineate, as we've been speaking here, all of the examples, and it was not just intended to be those providing clean out services or collecting, we've been calling it collecting junk, but I think the differential is that they actually provide a clean out service. They don't just go and pick up junk, that there's an added service that goes along with that. So just wanted to clarify that it was a very broad, can't think of what you don't know at the time and name it when you don't know that it exists. So
Thank you, Beth, for clarifying that, because I've sat at Metro Central where those vehicles bring in material and it's not junk. There's a lot of valuable materials in that stream. And so from a reuse perspective as well, I think that it's an opportunity.
Well, yes, but in other societies, the poorest of the poor are allowed to actually go into the landfill and pick out anything that's reusable and take it and do something with it. It's probably not going to work in our jurisdiction, but that's how other people are handling the question of what one person thought was garbage, somebody else thought was quite valuable and was willing to do something with. I have a question back to I guess actually Beth. What's EPA or Rosalind? What's EPA's role? I'm going to give you an example that didn't happen here. It happened in Florida. So ever since I started to learn to fly, we were told to check the sump for water in the gas. We take out about 2 tablespoons out of each tank, and then we just threw it out on the grass or on the pavement or something, until a flight school down in Florida, a big one, got fined $30,000 for throwing gas out in the atmosphere. At which point everyone, it had a really chilling effect. So everybody went out and got a little canister, and we now pour our leftover gas back into the tank or into the little canister that they've provided for us. We, as an industry, we are no longer throwing a 1/4 cup of gas out every time we fly the airplane. I anticipate those kinds of changes occurring over time. And so it's not because suddenly pilots discovered that they were concerned about the atmosphere. It's because somebody got a $30,000 fine. And for many of the flight schools, that would put them out of business for the year. So what's EPA, where does the dividing line between Metro and EPA coming in? Can EPA then come back and say something is essential? We have to deal with this differently than we do now?
I'm going to let you take that one, Rosalind.
I can take it some too, Ken. Solid waste collection is a hyper local issue. The feds do regulate hazardous waste and hazardous materials, and then there's REC-RAW, which is a famous hazardous waste law. That's a federal law. But when you get down to managing solid waste collection and determining the types of services provided in the community, it's a hyper local issue. And we see that in our community show up in that our board of commissioners is making decisions very frequently about the solid waste collection system. They set rates, they set service standards, they set all kinds of the rules and regulations. And so those are rules set at the local level based on guidance and parameters put in place by state and federal agencies. But really it comes down to a very local issue and a local decision-making process. And I'd also, let's make sure Sandra, I think, and Vinod have some hands up. If that doesn't answer your question, we can go elaborate further, but.
No, that's fine. Go, Sandra, you're next.
Thanks. I also had a question regarding 12.5. I'm more interested in, and I don't know if you can answer this, but the definition of the word collector, it does not say a collector for compensation. I mean, a collector could be any number of businesses that are operating right now. So I don't know if they're going to define that later. That's a total gray area that really is so vague that I don't know if there's anyone that can explain what they actually meant by the word collector in that particular.
That's a good question. I'm looking in the glossary of terms, and there's collection area and collection service. Collection service are a service that provides for collection of solid waste or recyclables, recyclable material or both. OAR 34090-010, that's on page 142, but there's not a definition of collector.
Or that it's a curbside issue. I mean, you can even consider the way unincorporated Washington County defines solid waste is basically, from talking to Tom, it's anything that a person doesn't want, that would throw away normally. So you could say thrift stores receiving stuff that you would normally not want anymore would be a collector. There's the food bank, well, not food bank, but there's other similar things. And this could just be a whole can of worms if you don't narrow it down and define it on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think collector is, the term collector in this context is not couched in collector for money, collector for compensation. That standard is in our code. But again, you could interpret 12.5 to say that's not a necessary standard, not a necessary threshold. It should be any collection service. So that is that's something to interpret for sure.
And I am happy to follow up with you afterwards to see if it's defined in Metro Code and Title V. That would be another place I could look and send you information about the definition of how Metro defines a collector. I can't speak from the top of my head if it's defined, but I can look at that after the meeting.
I also had a question, since I'm not in the industry, there have been previous regional waste plans, right? You're saying you go back to what, 1988 or even earlier? Has there been did you say there were 2 before this one that was adopted in 2019, or there's 3? Okay. Did they all have timeline goals like this one's for 2030?
They all look pretty different. One was very vague. So when we were talking about this plan, we were comparing it. I can't speak from the top of my head which was which, but one was really vague and one was really specific. And this one's kind of in between. So it is. And this is a great question. I can't really speak in detail off the top of my head about it, but our intention was to be somewhere in the middle.
And did they all list goals too?
This one was unique in that it had specific goals and specific actions. I can look at the past plans to refresh myself on how it's different and follow up with you, but or see, I'm assuming that you're trying to see if it said anything about this issue, or perhaps 12 point. No, okay.
I'm just wondering if all the goals were accomplished in that time frame. To see it. I mean, this one, the other 3-year plan's already a year behind.
Yeah,
that goal's not even on that. Some of these goals may not be completed by 2030, and I just wanted to see history on that.
And the other big difference, which I'm very proud of, is that this one has indicators for measuring progress, and the previous ones did not. So we intentionally put the indicators in there. They may not be perfect, they may change a little bit, but we're working with local government specifically on what you're talking about. And that's how we measure impacts and outcomes in an effort to retune and learn from what we're doing in an effort to improve it. So the previous plan basically had measurement TBD, and it was never done, in my opinion, but I was not there. And that was why we really made it a point to have a measurement framework and a reporting framework that holds us accountable. Yes, we are a little behind, but we just went through COVID and some other major reorg within our department. So we acknowledge that, and we're going to have our first regional waste plan progress report available on the progress of the plan this November. So that is on, we are actively working on that, and that will be available soon.
I would add real quick, sorry, Ken, I would add, Sandra, that the regional waste plan is very much aspirational in a sense. I think it is, many of the elements in the regional waste plan are not even requirements of local government. They are guidance and direction for local government. So I anticipate it would be it's an ambitious plan, and 2030 is going to get here before we know it. So we're going to be working on many elements of this regional waste plan through 2030. And so that's just an important framework for us, and to be realistic with ourselves as well when we work on implementing the regional waste plan.
And if you look at the evolution of containment plans like this, they move very slowly, and putting you've made two major steps, putting metrics in to be able to define what, measure what constitutes success, and then close the loop and come back and look and see if you achieve success, because there's just a tremendous number of plans that never get beyond or haven't yet gotten beyond the aspirational stage. A good place to, an interesting place to look for how this has evolved is getting lead out of the atmosphere. It's been a 40-year process, but we're down to, minuscule amount compared to what we had before we started making unleaded gas and what have you. And we will shortly have probably completely lead-free fuels. I mean, they're going to be eliminated altogether. The biggest source of lead pollution in the atmosphere right now is small aircraft. And it's always bad when you get to be number one on the list. But going from there, anyway, but the point is, it's taken a long time and there have been a lot of steps along the way, and they've really not even done as effective a job as Metro has on closing the loop and going back with the metrics and seeing if they really are hitting their targets in the various areas. So
I had two things. Well, one I had, then one came up. So I don't know if Sue and Beth were on the email that I think Rosalind forwarded from Luis at Metro, where he outlined his memory of it was that the goal of 12 is to regulate the unregulated in some fashion at some point. So that was his recollection of it, and then I think there was other conversations around it. I was going to ask Carl, but I haven't been able to get a hold of him. So I think he was on that committee too.
Yeah, he was.
And then when we were in the subcommittee, we would discuss collection as the act of basically going out and collecting something, which is different than Goodwill accepting something. So I'm taking it I can take my garbage to the transfer station. I can't take everybody else's garbage to that. So I think that's how we differentiated collection versus accepting.
And Beth, you're up.
Thank you. I just wanted to speak to the aspirational portion of the regional waste plan and maybe confirm, because I wouldn't characterize those goals and actions. I mean, I think it gets confusing. What I see happening under the 3-year plan, and as the garbage haulers collectors are told by local governments that we need to do X, like standardized services among multifamily. I don't think we see that as something aspirational that we can just work toward. We understand that as something we're required to do under the timeline prescribed. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm happy to hear a regulator say something different to us. But I just wanted to be clear that what we see in the regional waste plan are all items that we are expected to work toward. And as they become items are addressed and discussed and delineated for implementation, we are to implement those. There is not a choice.
So that is not necessarily true, Beth, because the regional waste plan does distinguish required actions from non-required actions. And so the ones you just pointed out are examples of required actions. So the regional service standards are examples of required actions. Non-required actions, there's some actions related to youth engagement and advisory committees and decision-making bodies. So the county, as a subject of the regional waste plan, would not be held account for failing to implement that type of an action. So there is actions that are in the waste plan that are specifically identified as requirements for local governments, and thus the local governments make those requirements of the service providers doing the service under their authority. So there is a delineation, and I don't want to downplay the regional waste plan by calling it aspirational, and that's not what I intended to do. Those are certainly all goals and objectives that we find are important and are valuable and we should all work towards. I was just saying that in a sense that I don't want the expectation to be that in 2030 we've achieved all these plans, because we're not resourced to do that. We don't have a plan to be resourced to do that. And there's a lot of really big questions and a really big significant system changing some objectives in the waste plan. And so I think we just need to acknowledge that we are currently not equipped to fully implement the waste plan. And those conversations are ongoing with Metro and local government partners. And so there is some areas that are not necessarily requirements per se.
All right, we'll work on clarifying, and I appreciate your comments, Tom. Thank you.
So Tom, is it fair to say that operational practices are requirements and then committees and things that's what's the aspirational part?
Rosalind, can you speak to the required elements a little bit? I'm looking through the plan right now and I'm trying to identify in the regional waste plan, you'll see there's a image of a cart and a chasing arrows, and that is identified as a directive action. So on each action on the side of the regional waste plan, you'll see, I'm looking at 13.3 right now because that's just the page I'm on. It has 3 symbols. And if the symbols are highlighted or filled in, that means that symbol applies to that action. So the symbol with the roll cart and the chasing arrows is a directive action. That means it's a requirement of local governments and thus service providers under the system. So there's most actions in the regional waste plan are not necessarily directive actions per se, that local governments would say be out of compliance with the regional waste plan if they did not achieve or did not pursue those actions. Most of those requirements are in section 10, I think, which is the section that is related to kind of where Ken was going with this, the essential nature of the core services we provide. Those being the kind of the regional service standards and the multifamily service standards we recently adopted, the business food scraps collection requirement, the business recycling requirement, those kinds of standards that are not necessarily optional or they're a directive action from Metro to local governments.
And there are like educational requirements. So in the, one of the things that's helping us meet our DEQ requirements around education is the Recycle or Not campaign, which is a regional campaign that is included in agreements with local governments that they will promote that campaign and promote that tool. And so that's just an example. I also sent the 3-year work plan to Kathy and Thomas to distribute to this group. And that provides more information about which ones are required and provides a little bit more detail about the requirements.
So I also wanted, before we kind of go on much longer, I think this is a good opportunity for us to kind of reframe or re-emphasize the question that the committee is working. And that question that's before the committee is, we have an exemption request from Ridwell to exempt the practice of collecting hard to recycle materials from the requirement of obtaining a certificate. County code says that exemption request shall be based on whether or not that is not necessary to the implementation of the regional waste plan. So essentially, the question the committee has to answer is whether or not a service to provide collection services for hard to recycle materials is necessary to the implementation of the regional waste plan or not. So I think that's a good frame to think about. And we talked about this on the subcommittee. And maybe this is an opportunity for Ken and Vinod and then Sandra to kind of talk through what their discussions were and kind of their findings. One of the things that I think is really challenging, and I struggle with this, and we all struggled with this on the subcommittee, is the conversation. We want to go, I think, in conversation, in thought to solutions. We want to talk about the value of a service. We want to talk about how we would provide a service, how we would deliver a service. But I think we need to really answer the first question first, and that is whether this service is necessary to the implementation of the regional waste plan. And we need to identify what parts of the regional waste plan speak to this kind of exemption request. After we answer that first question, whether it's yay, it should be exempted, or no, it should not be exempted, then we can start talking about the solution side of it, in terms of if this service is in the system, what does it look like? How is it provided? If it's outside of the system, then it's a different discussion. But we need to answer that first question first. I don't know if I saw Vinod, gave me a confused look. So like I don't know if I explained it well, but I hope.
I was just working through the question because it's kind of
it's a double negative.
Yeah,
let me read it word for word from the code. So if certificates shall not be required of, so we're saying that's the exemption. Other persons, practices, processes, businesses, or wastes exempted by the board after receipt of a recommendation of the advisory committee on the basis of findings made after public hearing, which we did, that the same is not necessary to the implementation of the county or regional solid waste management plan. The same is not necessary to. You're muted, Ken. I saw you talking, sorry.
So I am, that's the exemption is what the same is
That's-
referring to.
That's the code, the same as. So the same is not necessary. So I guess you would say that's the requested exemption is the same. Sue, I see your hand up. You haven't had an opportunity to speak.
Oh.
My hand is up. And I guess I just would like to, maybe suggest to all of us that if we go back to the documents that staff produced on June 30th, where all the findings were outlined. This is the document that I go back to every time we have this conversation, because it puts it all in a nutshell as far as what we're supposed to be looking at to answer the question if we should allow an exemption. And that's just what I would suggest everybody do, is go back to that document and look at it and read through it a couple of times, because I am doing that to get a better idea of what your thought process is concerning this issue. I am a little confused about the 2030 waste plan and how some of these items in here can be stated, but not necessarily followed through on. An example of that would be 12.6, and it states that regulate facilities accepting garbage, recycling, food scraps, yard debris, and other solid waste generated from the region to advance progress toward achieving this plan's goals. That's something Metro is supposed to do, but there's no necessary action they have to take on that particular item. So as a member of GRAC, it's hard for me to say, well, we need to allow this when Metro isn't backing us up, that this is something that's really going to advance the goal of the plan. It's very confusing. The document is huge. I have looked through the whole thing, but I still go back to the June 30th paperwork from staff as my guiding document to think about in this process. Thank you.
Would it be helpful if I provided an example related to that action, or I'm not sure if I should address?
Well, yeah,
I think anything would be helpful.
I think let me try a little bit to answer to help Sue understand the directive action element too. It is a little bit confusing, Sue, and I don't know how well established it really is in terms of what. So I guess I would say that the directive actions in the regional waste plan are from Metro to local governments.
From state of Oregon to Metro to local governments.
Not necessarily, kind of.
In some cases.
Kind of. It's what Metro requires local governments to do. So Metro doesn't always require things of local governments. Sometimes we work together to come to a mutually agreed upon solution. Sometimes there's different ways, but there's also parts of the system that Metro says, thou shalt do this because we're regulating you as a local government. So the directive actions are not identifying things that Metro is required to do to itself. they're identifying things that Metro is requiring local governments to do. So that kind of answers your question. It's not saying that Metro doesn't have to regulate solid waste facilities because it's not a directive action. It's identified as a Metro action, and Metro is not directing itself through that kind of that mechanism in the regional waste plan, if that makes sense. Kind of. It is a little bit of a nuance, and I think it's an important thing to point out because you know, the regional waste plan is our regional waste plan, so the local governments are signed on to partners to the regional waste plan, but there is elements of it that are more directive towards local government than they are to Metro per se.
Well, and I think that it's a huge document. There's a lot that is hoped to be accomplished by 2030. And I think that's what this kind of a plan does. Not all of those goals are going to be met for sure, but there are things in there to strive for. I get that. And it's, you know, it's a lot. It's a big ask for everybody, I think.
Very much so. Yeah, I would agree. So I don't know, Ken, Vinod, Sandra, do you guys want to talk about the subcommittee and kind of do a report out, and then we can continue the discussion, or how do you want to take that on?
I would recommend that we meet at a separate time and figure out, see if we can nail down what kind of report we're going to pass on, even if it's a report we can't agree on anything, and then send it to the and hopefully propose something to the overall committee to either make a finding yay or nay, or sit on our hands and make a finding nay. I mean, that's pretty much just. Go ahead, Vinod.
So I was just gonna for one of the reasons to have this, Sue, is for people that maybe that weren't familiar with the regional waste plan to kind of get up to speed, because it's really what's shaping this conversation. So we want to know if you had any specific questions or things you want us to delve into. I think what Ken's saying is that, so we were split. We were a 2-to-1 vote on whether they should be exempted or not for multiple reasons, whether there's, you know, why the system was built this way, how they align with the elements and the parts of the you know, what, like 12.5 or in 10, where it's, you know, implement safety, consistent safety and emissions, things that are going to be hard if you're not in the system. And so and I don't want to talk for Sandra. I mean, you know, I think we all like the idea of the service. It's just, does it fit in the system? Should it be regulated? Are you creating a tear in the fabric that's going to unravel if we make an exemption that's open to everybody, not just one company? Now you have to hunt down everybody that's doing it. Whereas we have a pretty locked up system, and that, not, sorry, Rosalind, but I've never seen Metro back off more regulation. You know, we're on top of the 582. The Metro is looking at ways to further regulate metro area MRFs that might not be equal to the statewide regulations. So I think just my interpretation of the spirit of what's in the document, it's designed to make sure that people aren't slipping through the cracks somehow, and we have things that aren't being regulated in a system that's already very regulated. So sorry, Rosalind.
No, that's okay, Vinod. And I did want to kind of touch on that, the project that you're talking about, the MRF Standards Project, which is looking at how regulations and Metro's role in regulating material recovery facilities where our recyclables go, such as Far West Fibers. So this project is looking at what should Metro do, if anything, before 582 is implemented, to make our recycling system more resilient and address the issues that 582 was intended to address. We are looking at that project right now specifically to MRFs, but it will apply to everyone else that we regulate around recyclables eventually. That's the idea. And because the plan is really focused on equity, and I think equity also means within the system that everyone's held to the same standard. I think, Sue, what you're talking about is kind of what are the parameters on that system, because we talked about, you know, thrift stores and things that are regulated right now. So we're really, or the junk removal sites, like how far should Metro go and local governments when we talk about regulations around recyclables? Because there's lots of facilities that accept recyclables that aren't regulated. So that's where we look for community engagement and community involvement. Our intention is to make a fair system and not just, you know, target Vinod in this case, but that it would apply to all facilities, including Ridwell. If Ridwell became an authorized hauler and had a facility, our role is to regulate that facility just like we regulate Far West Fibers, for example. So that includes market reporting of where they send their recyclables, because we want to ensure that recyclables are managed without negative impacts to communities that accept them. So, you know, we are intending, we're not just targeting MRFs right now. The intent is to see how this would apply to the rest of the system. But where that ends, I think, is how we, you know, where we engage council and core and it also depends on staff capacity, to be honest, because all of this work that we're talking about is expensive. So.
And I'm going to call you off this topic. I'm going to call you next week if you're around. I have some questions.
Yes, I heard that was coming.
Sandra, did you want to share anything about the subcommittee conversation and your perspective?
Where do I begin? No, I don't know what to say. See, I'm a public member and I represent the people of unincorporated Washington County. And the people have overwhelmingly said they want this hard to recycle service. That's why I asked about defining what collector is. That's why I asked if all these goals will be met. There is this 12.5 may not even be discussed. It may be several years. The public wants this now. I don't see why we can't offer a temporary exemption or even just an exemption until 12.5 gets honed in, discussed, defined, and implemented. Because right now there's many other companies that are operating right now without a certificate that are doing the same, very similar things that would fall under that category. And I would guess if we voted against it, it would be a year, maybe even longer, probably a lot longer before we get any type of hard to recycle curbside thing implemented through the system or whatever. So, and that's not what the people want. There's got to be some kind of compromise. I mean, it's feeling like it's taking a step back to stop recycling. We need, I mean, there's so many changes going on. There's so many things that are happening. There's apps for everything now, and there's so many new things that come up every day and new companies that come up every day. I found out this week about a company that you can subscribe to, and you can go to certain restaurant. I don't know if it's restaurants or it's like food carts and things, where you can sign up to get a reusable container, to-go container, and then you take it home and then you bring it back to a place and get a new one. These things crop up every day. There's so many new products and new services that come up, and to stifle this progress, I don't think is the way to go. I mean, rules are meant to be challenged and changed if it benefits the greater good of the society, and that's how I see it.
One of the major disappointments I had when I got on the school board was I assumed that there was a universal interest in education on the part of parents. And sadly, but the case is that only about 10 to 15 to maybe 20% of the parents really are interested in what happens at the schools or what goes on. They're very vocal. like yourself in this area. But the other 80%, as long as that yellow school bus came in the morning, took the kids and brought them home in the evening, fed, that was an important thing. They were happy with what the schools were doing. I came away with the impression that, 70 to 80% of the people couldn't even come up with a definition for what a good education was, much less agree on what elements of it were important for the school to provide. It was very disappointing for me. And I think the same thing applies to your interest in this. I think that when you say there's a large outcry for support for this, I'm not convinced that the majority of the people give a rip or even are aware. I think that there's a small core of socially aware, environmentally aware people who want to make sure that things that shouldn't go in the landfill don't go in landfill. But I think most of the population, it's just not on their radar. You'd have more objection if you wanted to eliminate high school football than you would with picking up garbage. You got your hand up, Vinod.
Yeah, so I was going to say this is what Tom was warning us against because we can't avoid it. We're not talking. When they're saying it's not getting rid of the service, and like in other counties or cities, they're looking at subcontracting. So there's a way for them to operate, but it's within the system. So it's not hey, get rid of it completely. It's hey, there's a way to do this and build them into the system instead of being an exemption. So I know I went on the weeds, but I just wanted to say that we weren't talking about not doing it because like right now in Vancouver, Waste Connections is offering a similar service to them. So and that's already running. So
And is it part of their normal fare structure? Are they?
Not that I know if it's an increase. It's the same type of subscription service, but it's similar. It's a similar pick up things.
As I understand it, that's actually a program in competition to Ridwell directly, and it's not regulated by the city of Vancouver or Clark County. So, but Washington's different. Again,
Yeah.
recycling in Washington is a totally different regulatory scheme and structure. So it's hard for us to look at Washington. But you're right, that does, and as an example of a solid waste collection company first providing a service that is very similar. So it's a service that can be provided by a variety of companies. It's not just the one company can do it. I think one thing that would be challenging is, and then Sandra points this out, is what happens between the time. So there is, time it takes to develop a program and then time that is after a decision is made. And that I don't think we should use that as our barometer for making a decision. We should focus on what we think is the right decision, but it will have impact and it is real. So.
So if I can just jump in quickly, I just want to clarify, I think it came up here before, but it's been several months now that the Washington County garbage haulers have and made a presentation that they would provide these services, but we've been instructed that we needed to wait for this process to conclude and we would need to work with our local government regulators and go through the government process before we could do that.
And this exemption does include them, and I would like to see the haulers do it. I would like to see Ridwell. I would like to see all of this going down. But if we vote no, this will not happen for at least a year. I can guarantee that. I mean, look how long we've been hashing this out for what, 4 or 5 months now, and not getting much farther. I feel it's a long process.
So do you want to schedule a time for the three of us to get together and hammer on each other again?
Sue's got her hand up. Let's see, Sue.
Oh, Sue, go ahead.
I just think I have to say that the way I'm looking at this is Ridwell, it would be providing a service for a fee that people can do on their own. So you can take any of the materials that Ridwell would be collecting someplace to manage them responsibly. I think that might not be entirely true, but for the most part, I think that's true. What I question here and not sure about, and Tom, maybe you can tell me this, is that if we were to grant an exemption to Ridwell, that would open the door would all of the haulers then be able to also collect the material, but it would have to be outside their regular route? It would have to be a separate truck. They could charge to pick up the materials, the same as Ridwell does. Is that true?
Yes, I don't know. Yes. Down to the level of detail of a separate truck outside of the same routes. I don't know if that's necessarily true. That if it was an exempted service, the costs would not be allowed to be included in the regulated system. So an example, Pride operates a paper shredding business that is not part of the franchise or their certificate. Those costs associated with that paper shredding business cannot be put onto the rate setting system. So those can't be part of the rates, but the county doesn't tell Pride how they run their paper shredding business. So I think if there was an exemption, there would be nothing to prevent any company, including the solid waste providers, from providing the service. They would just have to ensure that the costs of providing that service don't get put onto the regulated system. So
then, for instance, as a homeowner, if I was to say my hauler started to pick up the exempted material, styrofoam, and they picked it up, that would be a separate charge. It would not be something that the county would be looking at as far as a rate schedule or anything like that. So it'd have to be a negotiation between the individual and the hauler to come up with that.
essentially, I mean, Ridwell sets a standard rate. So my assumption is that if there was an open market business, then we can use Waste Connections, I guess, as the example in Vancouver. My understanding that it's happening on the open market. I could be corrected if I'm wrong, but I think they're charging $10 a month for the extra Recycle Plus is what they call it. And you get a bin and it goes onto your doorstep, just like Ridwell's bin does. So it is a completely separate service. Technically, a customer could negotiate with Waste Connections probably for the price on that, but essentially my assumption is it'd be more like this is the service, it costs $10. Do you want it or not? As what Ridwell does with their subscription fees and subscription services, but it would not be regulated by the county. If it was outside, if it was an exemption, if it was inside the certificate, the county would have the responsibility to ensure that the rates are fair and reasonable. But then
Ridwell would not be able to pick it up
unless they were working under the authority of the solid waste collection companies through a subcontract or some other mechanism.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Does anybody have anything else they want to do?
Yeah, but it's not sitting here, so.
Well, I wasn't going to go there, but you're right. Okay.
So what's next steps? It feels like we're missing some committee members, which I think is challenging too. Ashvin and Kathy, Christy, and Carl couldn't make it this evening. It was a little bit late notice that we found that out, so we apologize for that. Maybe we could have pivoted a little earlier, but I think they're going to be important members of the discussion. It sounds like Ken, and maybe at least Ken, is interested in reconvening the subcommittee to noodle on this further and maybe find another way to share information with the rest of the committee. So I don't know what you think is the right path forward, Ken.
As I understand it, we have been tasked to either make a finding or not make a finding. And I think, at the very least, we have to report back to the commissioners and say, yes, we agreed to this finding, or no, we could not reach agreement on any finding, and we are going to not make a finding.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be right, and we can talk with Brad. He's not here tonight, but the code doesn't say that you have to make findings that are unfavorable. The code says in order for the exemption request to go to the board, it has to have a favorable recommendation and findings from the committee. So if there's no findings and the committee has decided it doesn't want to make findings, or is not planning to make findings, or cannot make findings, and I think that is the same as an unfavorable recommendation. That's how I read the code.
That's how I read it.
And that is an option for the committee as well, if it's an impasse in a sense.
Okay, well, for tonight, can you find an appropriate time for everybody next week or two, and we'll do our part and then report back that we could or couldn't reach agreement to the county?
We can do that. Do you, are we talking the subcommittee to reconvene, or you
subcommittee.
want the whole committee? Okay,
Well, actually, it's the whole committee that has to make the finding or not. So see how quickly you can put together a whole committee meeting specifically to deal with that one issue.
Kathy, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, we have our next GRAC committee meeting October 13th. Today's September 9th. We could wait until then and then make one topic on the agenda, and it's just essentially similar to tonight, but we wouldn't have a presentation, and have an action item if you want to take a vote at that time. In between, the subcommittee could get together again, or we could, there's a variety of ways that we could engage.
We have a full committee, a short full committee meeting. What I would hope would be a short meeting between now and the next scheduled meeting.
The bylaws actually speak to the ability to call a meeting off schedule. So I think it's the majority of, I think that you can call the meeting if the people present agree, Ken, I think we can call a meeting.
Yeah, just keep in mind the difficulty of scheduling. I mean, that's my only, even when it's standard dates, it's difficult. So, but we certainly could do our best and, keep it to like maybe 2 weeks from today. I mean, maybe that's a good
Yeah, and
one.
if you could send something around and see how many people respond and say they will or will not be able to come, because there's no point in doing it if we're only going to get the same group of people. We'll just wait till next month's meeting.
We can do that.
Okay.
And I would say before we close, I see a attendee has their hand up. So when we move into the final public comment period, there's a 5-minute opportunity.
Oh, good. Okay.
So if we're done with that discussion, do we feel good to move on? So we're going to work on looking at a time in 2 weeks, and we're going to survey the committee whether or not they can accommodate that. And if we can't find a time, we'll plan to reconvene in October with the normal schedule. Correct?
Yes, please. And go ahead and bring the outside person in. We'll listen to what they have to say.
Hi, this is Caleb Weaver with Redwell. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hey, all, look, I appreciate folks engaging in such a extended conversation about this this topic again. And I just wanted to clarify a few points and make sure, and again, some of these things have been hit, but just to be very clear, an exemption doesn't need to mean zero regulation. You can certainly put conditions on the exemption that allow a degree of oversight. The exemption requests, right, would only be for items that are not picked up as part of the franchisee or the agreement with the licensee haulers. So if that changes at any point, which would be an option that you all will have, the exemption would narrow if at any point you all decide to bring these items under the existing system. So I guess I would just really push back on the notion that granting an exemption means throwing the doors wide open and starting down a path that you all are somehow the ability to ensure consistent service throughout the county is somehow undermined. That is still very much within your all's control, and all we're talking about is some of the committee members have noted is an optional additional service for people who are interested in trying to keep items out of the landfill and to dispose of items that they think are that are currently disposing of into a landfill and they don't want to be, making it easier for them to do that on an optional basis. So again, it is a little bit hard for us, and I think the hundreds of people that have expressed interest in obtaining this service in Washington County that have been unable to because of the extended process that has been undergone here, to understand why they are being prevented from purchasing an additional service that would enable them to help achieve the goals that the metro regional plan so clearly outlined. Again, those are the aspirational goals, but how you all are again seeming to hedge on enabling people to make it easier to achieve these, to pursue these broader goals, I think is a bit hard to understand. And again, would really encourage you to look at other options if you're not comfortable with a broad exemption, but to find ways to ensure that there's some oversight. Again, and Ridwell welcomes the haulers and others providing a service, then combining a competing service. Nobody's looking for any special handouts or gifts here. We were simply the ones that requested the exemption because there's an interest in the community in this service. So we stand ready to work with anybody. As some have noted, we are open to conversations on how we work together. Our goal is to help people waste less. And so if there's ways to work together to do that, we are open to it. We're not looking to hide anything from anybody or get away or get out of the system. Again, the franchise system, it all still will exist. This is merely just enabling people to choose an optional service. So again, we appreciate the discussion. If anybody has any questions, would certainly encourage you to reach out to me or funnel those questions to Tom, and I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you all so much for the time.
Thank you.
I have a question for Caleb. So we've talked about how other cities are looking at subcontracting. What's your feeling about subcontracting and working within the system that way?
So for us, we again, that falls under that category. If there's ways where that is a way that makes sense to bring our services quickly to a community, and we can do it under terms that work, we're open to doing that. Again, we're exploring whole wide variety of options. Again, we're happy to submit to reasonable regulations if that's the way to go, exemptions with conditions if that's the way to go. And again, one of the options that we're currently talking about in one area is the subcontracting idea. So again, we're absolutely open to it. Our goal is to try to respond to community demand and help achieve these community goals. So again, it's one of the many things on the table. We're completely open and transparent about what we do, how we do it, and what we're trying to do, and really just want to begin to help people make a difference and do their part to help the planet.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that.
Can I ask a
Sandra,
question?
go ahead.
Mr. Weaver, do you provide the service to apartment complexes? Not the plexes, but if someone lived in an apartment, could they also get your service?
We do, yeah. It can be a little bit more complex to set up, but we do. We also do work with apartment buildings when there's an opportunity there, although that's less common just because of the challenges and sometimes working with the whole building.
Yeah.
Right. Anybody else in the attendee pool wish to speak? I'm not seeing anything, so I think we're good. Ken, you can go ahead and close out the meeting.
Okay. Then thanks everybody for coming, and we are adjourned. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for attending the September 9th Garbage and Recycling Advisory Committee. As we mentioned at the beginning, this was recorded and you will find that on our website within 1 week. Thank you and have a nice evening.